Hey everybody, this is Bo Sanders, and I wanted to respond to some of the feedback I got on the video, Why Evangelicals Can't Do Critical Race Theory. There were almost 100 shares, thousands of views, more comments than I could possibly keep track of, but most of the feedback seemed to fall into some very consistent categories, and so I thought I would respond to that. So what I want to do is tackle the four major obstacles that I brought up: individualism, scholarship, Marxism, and diversity. And then the fifth and final sort of thing that made it all cohere together, which is the nature of evangelicalism and how it has changed in the last 70 years since the 1950s. So on the issue of individualism, the feedback was fairly consistent. People acknowledged, yes, this is an issue, that evangelicals primarily view sin as a personal issue of the heart. But one of the things that really intrigued me is how many people said, why does it have to be either or? Can't you do personal and systemic? And so I think that this is an area of common ground that actually bodes well for some collaboration going forward and some future conversations. I'm actually intrigued by this. But everyone did seem to acknowledge that, yes, if you view sin as an individual problem, then you are going to have problems when you do a larger address that critical race theory does. And so that is going to be an issue. The one thing I just wanted to point out is that if you use individualism to get out of addressing larger issues of systemic racism and sort of corporate sin, social issues, that's where the issue comes. Is if you say, I'm not personally a racist, right? If it gets you out of that conversation, then you don't see the need, feel the burden to address the larger issue. And so that would be the one thing, is that you're right, it doesn't have to be either or. And you can have an individual expression of sin, but if your absence of that, saying, well, I'm personally am not a racist, and therefore, then that would be the issue of concern. The second issue was scholarship, and that evangelicals, because of their subculture or siloed nature over the last 50 years in a reaction to their withdrawal from culture and the creation of a subculture, have not addressed the kind of scholarship that is critical theory is based in, and therefore critical race theory is somewhat alien to them. So a couple people pointed out some current PhD students or very new faculty hires that do engage critical race theory, and so that's a great thing. I'm very excited about that. My one caution would be, let's see what happens when there's the first round of, say, hiring, and they do a discourse analysis about how the search committee is put together or how the candidates are filtered, or when they critique the university's new honors program that is entirely based in the Western canon of literature. So that would be my one thing, is I'm excited that they're doing it, those who are, but let's see how it goes in the next 5 to 7 years when they come up for tenure review and stuff like that. The third issue was this thing of Marxism, the boogeyman of cultural Marxism. And actually, I did not realize until this video came out and I started doing more research about how long of a legacy this boogeyman has. It turns out that since the 1950s, so in the last 70 years, this has been a major ploy by those who didn't want to address systemic issues and institutional systems of power. This cultural Marxism. And so it really got me intrigued. And one of the things I keep finding myself saying is, who cares? Like, don't worry about, you can do critical race theory for a decade without engaging in much Marxism or Marxist thought. But one of the things that I'm suspicious of is it's that it's a red herring. So a red herring is like, the analogy is if you were to drag a very smelly fish, a red herring, across the path that you wanted to cover, when the dogs come, on the smell path, and they get to the red herring, because it's a stronger scent, they turn off the course and then they don't keep pursuing the main trail. So this is a logical fallacy, or in rhetoric, that's what it would be called. And so I actually think that this Marxism, this cultural Marxism, is a red herring, because what they don't want you, what the institutions and evangelical leaders are actually afraid of, is Foucault. And when I used to teach a seminary class on culture and communication, one of my favorite components to the teaching part of that was when we talked about Foucault, specifically genealogy of power, so tracking how things came to be, and discourse analysis. And I was always trying to convince my students, whether you've ever heard of Foucault's name or not, or know anything, we actually live in Foucault's world. That has trickled down from the academy, and is so prevalent now. Whether like if you ever look at Twitter or anything at all, how we analyze things about who gets to speak at what conference and all sorts of stuff, and representatives in our government. We live in Foucault's world. We want to know who's at the table. How do you get a seat at the table? Who's in charge of the table? How do you get dismissed from the table? Is there anything power, money behind the scenes? So it's the question behind the question. And so, yes, it makes sense to me why evangelical leaders, and specifically institutions like denominations and seminaries, colleges, universities, don't want Foucault in the room. But the thing is, it's always already present because it is disseminated in our culture, and it is, for many of us, we're so conditioned in it that it's almost, we don't even notice that we're employing these techniques that actually critical theory is very good at. And so critical race theory is one of those things that has made its way through most of the culture in a way that you don't actually have to even know what it is. It's just second nature now. It's almost like being bilingual. Sometimes people don't even know that they're thinking in these constructs and in these mental frameworks, but it definitely is in place, and it's a very, very powerful influence in our 21st century society. The fourth block that I brought up was diversity. And I was actually pleasantly surprised at how much consensus there was. So one of the upsides of evangelicalism is that they're very diverse racially. And so this is a good thing, except that, and a lot of people acknowledged what I was saying. So while that is a good thing, sometimes institutions will actually hide behind diversity so that they don't have to deal with other issues. For instance, they will say the African American community is socially conservative, or that the Latinx community, being Catholic in background primarily, is anti. So when it comes to homosexuality, sometimes they'll hide behind diversity and being socially conservative so that they don't have to deal with issues relating to the LGBTQ community. But specifically in what we're talking about, because if you can celebrate diversity in your population, your congregations, that sometimes can become a barrier to addressing issues of leadership and representation in the upper levels of power. So that would be a concern, especially related to issues of recruitment, funding, training, empowerment, those sort of issues that critical race theory wants to address. The final issue, which is my favorite, is the nature of evangelicalism. And I'm proposing that evangelicalism has migrated in the last 50 to 70 years. And one of the feedback that I got the most is that I painted evangelicalism with too broad of a brush, or that I didn't understand the difference between evangelicalism and fundamentalism. And when I asked people to explain that to me, like say, okay, then you tell me what the difference is, all that people could do is say that I didn't have a broad enough definition of evangelicalism, because I said that it had become just a set of conclusions. But no one provided me a better definition of contemporary evangelicalism. All people could do, if they tried at all, was to point back to Bebbington, which I pointed out in the original video, is European and from a previous century. So yes, the Christocentric, the Biblicism, the conversionism, the life change, those are four really good things in Bebbington's quad. But that's not what evangelicalism is in its contemporary manifestation, specifically in North America, which then means the globe. And so my thesis that evangelicalism is a set of conclusions about whether it's the nature of Scripture, infallibility, inerrancy, inspiration, LGBTQ issues, creation, end times stuff, other religions, all sorts of things, that it is a constellation of convictions. And here's how you know one saying has some merit, is that if you claim to be evangelical, but vary on any of those issues, then some evangelical gatekeeper will come and say, you're not evangelical. You can call yourself an evangelical, but because you don't believe these things, you don't belong. So this is the believe, behave, belong triad. And so while I got lots of pushback about not understanding evangelicalism or not being generous enough in my reading of what it has become, not a single person provided me a better definition or really attempted at any level to give a better framing. So you can disagree with me and say that it's not just a set of convictions, but that it's a community of belonging or whatever. But the simple fact is, if you claim to be evangelical and you vary on any of those issues, somebody will say, then you're not evangelical. So you say, no, I am, I belong, I am an evangelical, I just believe something different about these things. And they'll say, then you're out. That's how you know it is a bounded set, not a center set if you're using game theory. So those are some of my responses to the feedback that I got on why evangelicals can't do critical race theory. I want to thank all of you for the feedback, the shares. I got emails and texts and phone calls, comments on the Facebook, on the blog. It was wonderful engagement. I hope it's an ongoing conversation because this is going to become, as I said, an ever increasing relevant issue. And so I hope to keep the conversation going. Let me know what you think. Point me in good directions and we will keep the conversation going.